Welcome to another episode of the CattleUSA Daily Podcast. Today we are welcoming back John Campbell. John has been coming on the podcast for the past few weeks, but John is also someone that if you have been around the CattleUSA YouTube channel for a while, he is someone you are familiar with. John is an amazing person that we are welcoming on to share just thoughts about the cattle market, what is going on in the auction world, and what is going on just in the markets in general. We start out this podcast with a little bit of a cattle market update, what John is seeing out at their market in Colorado, and then also just kind of what we're seeing as far as the temperature of the world goes as far as the cattle market, kind of our candid thoughts for the fall, what we're going to be seeing in the next few weeks as far as all of that goes, and just thoughts on this wild ride that is the cattle market right now. And then after we get through that, we are jumping right into a main topic for this podcast as well, where we are talking the buyer's side of the auction and what are buyers looking for when they come to the cattle auction, and just everything that entails, specifically for our sellers out there. What do our sellers need to know about what our buyers are looking for, and how can we help bridge some communication and just have the best possible outcome that we can have when we take cattle to the market? So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into this podcast with John. But before we do, if you guys could like, subscribe, rate, review, do all of those things. We really appreciate it here at the team. And if you are listening on a podcasting platform, make sure you head on over to YouTube. It is always fun being able to watch these videos and see them put out there as well. So make sure you head on over to our YouTube. We've got all of those links linked down below for you guys, where you can like, subscribe, rate, review, do all the things. We always appreciate it. And let's go ahead and just get into this podcast with John. John, welcome back to the podcast. Happy Monday. Tell me what's going on in the world of Colorado right now at your markets. What happened last week? What are we seeing in the cattle industry? All the things.
You know, it's an excellent time to be in the auction business. We're seasonal here in a lot, as I hit on last week. You know, everybody's got grass and pounds as dollars, so really pretty typical. You know, we are very, very seasonal and pretty light here through the summer. But man, oh man, what an excellent time to be headed to the auction, to be in the auction business. Everybody's happy when they leave, and they're happy before they even get here. But you know, I don't think there's ever been a time when the auction way of selling cattle and the auction atmosphere just really couldn't be more timely. You know, anytime you have big swings in the market like we're going, and we're just going straight up, if you want to be on the cutting edge of the market, boy, the public auction is the place to be. And that's because we have seen nothing but increases in the market on, I say, a weekly basis, but almost a daily basis. And anytime you've got that much competition and that much demand, and you don't have to, you know, be any kind of a market analyst to figure out that this market is just getting higher and higher and higher every day. Who knows how long it's going to last, but the atmosphere and the place to take advantage of that is live competitive bidding at the auction. You are getting the most current market for any particular class at the public auction at that particular time. So, you know, people are not going out into the country, especially not now, but never. They don't leave the house saying, well, I'm going to go out so I can pay more for one. You have to provide that atmosphere if you're going to get somebody to pay more for one, and the auction is really the place to go. And I'm optimistic right on out through the fall. You know, and we have of course a shortage into the fall. I think we're going to go into a shortage of fed cattle. That's gonna keep the supply of beef on the market, and we're a couple steps removed from that, but not really on our feeder cattle. So supplies are tight. We have an overabundance of feed, and it is cheap. I was talking to a farmer today that farms over around Lamar, Colorado, and farms a lot of corn, and some of it has to do with high-priced cattle, but he said, John, one steer is worth more than an entire truckload of corn. And I thought, how can that be? He said, well, you get $2,500 for a steer. I said, yeah, we can sure do that. He said, a load of corn won't bring $2,500. So a lot of hay, a lot of corn, sorghum, wheat hay, triticale, from this country east, Lahana East, there is an over supply of feed, and it is not worth much, and it is in such a composition that it's about got to go through cattle. So you're dealing with another aspect of the market. People that might normally be selling commodities, boy, about the only way you get rid of tons and tons of baled triticale or baled wheat hay, or to this point even corn, you're going to have to put it through some cattle. So we're going to see the normal onslaught of demand from the cow calf guy, the stocker operator, the yearling operator, all classes of cattle. They're in the market. Plus, we've got this abundance of feed, and we're going to see a lot more farmers and a lot more grazers in the market this fall, which helps demand on a shorter supply of calves that we're going to be able to offer. I think those are going to be paramount into the price as far as the forecast goes. The greatest motivator there is all segments of that industry, whether it's even the cow calf guy wanting to buy replacement females, wanting to buy stock cows. You've got the stocker, the background operator, and you've got the feed yard guy. Every entity there was profitable last year and it has been the last couple years. And there's no greater motivator than coming off a profit. And you combine that with shorter numbers of cattle, abundance of cheap feed, barring any catastrophe somewhere, like I mentioned, somebody falls over dead at a Burger King, why, we always run the risk of that. But I am super optimistic about what's going on and what's going to happen this fall. Once these farmers get in a posture and a position, and once we start seeing some numbers coming to the auction, I think the market has got potential to go even higher. And I get asked every day, how much better? How much better can it be? 9 years out of 10, we're going through the doldrums, the summer doldrums right now. Now's when the market is usually pretty tough. And Christ, we're putting money on it every day. What's it going to be when people are ready for some cattle? So really optimistic. Again, the auction's a place to bring them where you've got a full complement of buyers for every class of cattle, all assembled in one place versus trying to trade with one person in the country. But I would probably always be guilty of saying that, especially this year. I think everything's great. At Winter Livestock, we will have a series of special calf sales starting October the 20th, and we'll run every Monday through November the 16th. And here we're fortunate we deal with enough calves that we dedicate a day on Mondays to just merchandise calves for the calf sellers. And then we have yearlings on Tuesday and cows and bulls on Tuesday, every Tuesday as well. But we set aside 5 Mondays every year that we service just the calf seller. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to it. It's fun to sell them when they're this high.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. That's so exciting.
Last week, Lauren, we saw some awfully good prices. We had, 9-weight steers up to 322, which, that's kind of like, well, what's a car worth? It depends what kind of car you got and what you bring to the sale and what you're driving. But these were good cattle, good steers, but 3-colored cattle. I mean, it wasn't like they were all one reason. They were bought throughout the spring and put together and put into a grow yard, which we get a lot of those kind of cattle here. We're not a big wheat area, so the kind of cattle that you don't always see topping the market like a set of home raised all one color coming off grass might, but still really good cattle. They weighed close to 950 and brought 322, and the heifer mates off of them weighing just a little over 7 at 336, and some 8-weight heifers at 321, which for the condition that they were in, the cattle all had some flesh on them, and sure, carrying adequate fill. That's why you come to the auction, so you recuperate some of your weight. But I thought it was a tremendous sale. I had some little light 3-weight calves bring 540 a pound. And we're just talking about packages of cattle in these calves. And again, I can't believe what they'll be worth when we start getting into some loads of some of these reputation calves. So be fun to find out.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very exciting time to be someone in the cattle business, in the auction business. And it's one of those things that we've talked about it before, John, that we don't really know what's coming around the corner, but darn it, we're holding on and we're here for the roller coaster ride, and it's a fun one right now, that's for sure. So, talking cattle market and bringing cows to the market, we've been kind of on a routine the past few weeks where we've been talking about different things that sellers, buyers look for, all of these different aspects. We've talked nutrition and health, we've talked transport. Gosh, we've talked so many different topics. Today, we're going to kind of dive into what buyers are looking for specifically when we're bringing cattle to the market, how to market our animals the absolute best. So, diving into that topic a little bit, John, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on what are buyers looking for when they are coming to the sale barn. What are they looking for as far as these animals go?
Right. Well, and I think the nice thing about the auction, you've got a buyer for whatever you bring, whatever you've got. Is there an ideal? Yeah, there could be, and what we kind of hold true as well. These, here's the optimum of what's offered today at the auction. Well, that may be for one guy, but not for the next guy. So the beautiful thing about the auction, you have somebody and depth at every weight, every classification, every color of whatever you have. And so that's the fortunate thing about the auction. You can get rid of your good cattle, you can get rid of your middle class cattle, or if you've got some cuts or some cattle that need to come off the load, it's a one-stop shop. And there'll be competition for every class of that, regardless of what you got to sell. And that's a beautiful thing about it. Mostly, to reiterate what we talked a little bit about last week, quality is still job one. And quality is made up of not only the frame and the bone and the conformation, but also the condition that the cattle are carrying. Frame is really important anymore. When these people are finishing these calves, and when the calf buyer's taking them to a stocker or taking them to a yearling, they're getting these cattle bigger all the time. Now, that's not something you can change in one generation, or maybe you don't even want to. But as far as what a buyer is looking for, especially, he wants to know how much outcome those cattle have. And that's a combination, like I said, of the frame. Can I make them big? They're wanting these cattle at harvest to be 1,600 pounds. Well, some cattle have the composition to do that, and some don't. You can make anything weigh 1,600, but have they done it cost effectively, getting at that point? So that's one thing that they're looking at. There's some contracts out there for premium for some of these heavier carcasses. You can have frame. A Longhorn or a Corriente's got frame at 400 pounds, but you still got to hang some meat from them, meat on them, and they got to have some composition to them. And a lot of these exotics have entered into the market mainly because of the substance of bone those cattle are carrying. So the first thing that a buyer's looking at is he wants to distinguish, okay, they've got a lot of frame. How much bone are they standing on? And that's where you'll separate maybe some of the inferior performing cattle from the higher performing cattle is what we call the substance of bone. How much bone do those cattle have to hang this muscle mass to? And you got to have frame on them in order to make them big. And of course, conformation's important. The muscle, like I said, attached to the frame. They can look down the top line of these cattle and look by the condition. Now, is that muscle composition, or is that flesh, or is it compensatory gain on cattle that are thin? View them from behind. Just basic 4-H livestock judging, I would tell you. The higher volume, heavier muscled cattle that have more conformation, and combined with an adequate amount of condition, are certainly going to be the ones that merit the highest price. Condition, very, very important. How fat those calves are. The buyer is looking, what can I buy that will take best advantage of the feed that I have to give them? And so if you can take calves maybe with a little more flesh if you're going into a grow yard situation. If you're going to put them right back on feed, and of course the buyer always wants something that's thin in flesh because he wants to take it advantage, and he wants to recognize the compensatory gain that that animal's got. But versus a guy that's going to buy, say, a calf in the spring and turn him out on grass, well, he doesn't want to let the condition score of that animal decline until the grass kicks in and he can start appreciating how much those cattle are gained. So you'll see that in the spring of the year a lot of times because it's the difference in the buyer. You've got a guy that is buying cattle and he's wanting to go to grass with them. So he doesn't want cattle that he's going to have to let down before he can start and going again. And you'll see some cattle that are thin in flesh a lot of times might outsell cattle that maybe have superior genetics, but their composition is wrong for that time of the year. In the fall of the year, it varies by area, but in our area, other than over west, everybody's had a good summer. So all the condition scores of the calves are probably going to be pretty comparable. The calves are all going to be pretty adequate in their flesh, probably medium flesh on up, medium plus. So when you go to the grocery store and that's all they got to sell, that's what you buy. Ideally, yeah, we'd like to find a starved out calf that's thin and had a rough life and has more outcome and frame to really explode. But you're probably not going to find that, at least in this area this fall. So all those things you kind of have to weigh out. Disposition is another thing. If these cattle, as I mentioned, if you've been out handling them, feeding them, riding through them, and that doesn't mean with a motorcycle, but horseback or on foot. But boy, disposition is important. And if you got cattle that are bouncing off the ring here, they're probably going to bounce off the pen when that guy gets them home too. So you can have really, really good cattle, but if they are just a cotton picking wild, it makes a difference. And all of those characteristics, Lauren, have a value attached with them. And granted, we're at such elevated levels now, and you're dealing with such a short supply of cattle, all of those conditions may not be as significant as they would be in times of plenty. If you've got all the cattle in the world to choose from, buyers get a lot more picky at what they want, and small differences in condition, small differences in conformation, in bone, in disposition. Boy, oh boy, they'll just back right off. But because they know there's another lot or another lot or another lot behind them that maybe will fit their mold a little bit better. Again, that's the great thing about coming to an auction. We're going to be dealing with a lot tighter supplies this year. So you're going to see that discrepancy between all of those characteristics shrink because supply trumps all of that. And if you're going to get them, you got to get them because they're probably going to be higher next week and there'll be less of them to choose from. So all those factors kind of weigh in.
What are some immediate turnoffs or things that maybe they're not fully a turnoff, but they're, like you said earlier, there is a buyer for everything at the market, thankfully, but some indicators that might damage or just kind of impede on the performance of that animal in the ring?
Sure. We're fortunate here in Atlanta in that we have a lot of independent buyers, farmer feeders that are spending their own money. So what priorities to those guys may be a little different. As a whole, they're a little easier to sell to. They're a little more forgiving on a lot of those things because they're spending their own money, and boy, they're looking right at the product that they're going to take possession of. So, things like uniformity, condition, color, those things are all really important because those are physical aspects that we can reach out and touch. And we say, oh man, we like that. That's another attribute to the auction. You're not ordering it over the phone or through Amazon or picking up a phone and ordering a set of tires. Anytime I can get the buyers or we can get the buyers here where they can physically inspect the cattle, they're always willing to give more than they would give Lauren, you as an order buyer or me as an order buyer. They're going to cushion that order a little bit versus what they would give if they're here physically looking and buying the cattle. So when you're dealing with professionals and when you're dealing with order buyers, why, health, of course, is important. If you want to know what a turnoff is, try to sell a load of calves that has questionable cattle in the mix. Cattle that are just maybe about to break. They don't show the freshness. Their hair is kind of laying down. Their eyes are getting a little more dull. The professionals will pick up on that. So, that's really important. And calves that have had, 2 rounds of shots, as we mentioned before, there's getting to be a growing concern that way. Guys want the list of those calves. Of course, obvious things like the uniformity of the lot, the size of the lot, the color of the lot, and condition all the way through a particular draft. If you've got cattle that vary in condition, which if they're coming off the cow or coming off the same feed source, they ought to be pretty uniform condition wise. But so anyway, those things are all really critical and important, and order buyers are trying to fill an order. So they're looking at weights, they're looking at numbers, because the transactions here on people going very far, they're dealing with 50,000 pounds, and that's what they're shooting for. So, the closer you can get to that ideal weight with your consignment, the more merchantable those animals become. But that's pretty hard to do, unless you run 600-700 cows. It's pretty hard to have a draft of 500-pound calves, because by the time you steer an heifer and then size them 3 ways, you're probably not going to hit 500 pounders exactly. So the buyers are going to have to put some cattle together, and so it doesn't have to be the bigger lots like we mentioned. Usually they demand a little more presence and a little more respect than some of the onesie, twosie, threesies. But you'll see that at the end of the day also, or at the beginning, guys are wanting to get started, and they may have to fill out a load with 18s, 20s, just to make that magic number. And that's a pot load of cattle, because it costs them the same whether they're transporting 28,000 pounds or 50,000 pounds. So that's kind of what they're looking at. And they want cattle that complement one another, which if they're at an auction of very much volume, that usually doesn't pose much of a problem with them. And, getting back to the auction atmosphere, one thing I don't think a lot of people appreciate is that you've got an auction operator or a guy up in the block that really stands behind the seller. He's taken on the responsibility of the seller at the time the cattle are being sold. Any auction operator worth his salt is going to represent your cattle the way you would like them represented, and he's already shaped them up to sell. And if there's any cattle that needed taken off, any cattle needed evened up, size, they've already done all of that on your behalf. So not only as a seller can you sell with more confidence that way, because the auction, if there's any little odd cattle, they're off. We've sized the cattle so we have uniform lots that look really good. But also he's the go-between guy for the buyer. And the buyer appreciates that as well, too. I don't call up Lauren and say, hey, Lauren, you had a ding dong on that load of cattle I bought there at Winter Livestock from you. One held his head this way and had a foot about the size of your head. He goes back to the auction operator for that. So as a seller, you're relieved of a lot of that pressure and a lot of that negotiation that has to take place between a buyer and a seller. That's where the commission comes in. You've hired a guy to be your representative that will take the heat on all of that. And plus, he'll hand you all the gratitude that any of the buyers may have presented him with it. Man, I sure like those Moylan calves. Those things were great. Let me know next year when those calves come through. They just did a great job for you. Or, boy, John, I had one that just wasn't quite right on that. Take him to sell him, or else bring him back to me and I'll make it right. You know what I mean? So the buyer appreciates that because he knows who he goes to. We're fortunate we don't make a lot of adjustments, but if you do, hey, you've got a representative right there in the auction guy that handles all your troubles for you. And even though they're limited, he's an intermediary for you when you're selling the cattle. And he's also there in terms of market support too. He's going to make sure those cattle bring full value. So it's a win-win atmosphere, and just full circle, going right back to what we talked about today. Man, what a great concept to be involved in when the market's going straight up like it is.
Yes, it Absolutely is. Talking a little bit about, so we talked how like you are being represented at the sale barn as a seller, and it takes a little bit of the pressure off of you. But at the same time, you still kind of gain a reputation, especially if you go to the same sale barn week after week, year after year, you gain a reputation, right? How
Exactly.
much does that impact the way that those cattle sell in the ring?
Well, again, you've got a seasoned professional representing you, not only you, but your operation, your health program, your genetics, the numbers of cattle you raise, the quality of your program. You've got someone that should be so well versed in all of that and should know you well enough through your reputation. There's nobody can do as good a job at representing you than your auction operator. He's been to your place, he knows your operation, he knows the ins and outs, he knows your health, he knows your genetics, and he can kind of summarize all of that in a fashion and in a language that every potential buyer can comprehend. Just kind of like, don't do your own taxes. Pay somebody that knows what they're talking about and how they're doing it and can communicate with the IRS or whoever it may be as your representative. And it's the same way in the auction atmosphere. But because as far as a reputation, it takes years to develop one. But as people become more accustomed with your cattle, they have more experience with them. Like I said, they remember those names, and also there's a lot of behind the scenes activities that take place way ahead of auction time. Not only in advertising, but the same way if you consign your calves, I look at who's bought those calves the last 2 or 3 years. Hey, Lauren, we've got those XYZ cattle coming up next week. I know you bought them in the past, and so you reiterate to those people, remember, those were the ones that were this, that were this, that were this. And we start qualifying those cattle to fit a specific buyer because we know what class and what kind of cattle that buyer is buying from week to week to week. So we try to mold that consignor's cattle. And granted, we have some that won't fit you at all. Okay, we have another buyer in mind for those specific cattle. It's not just a general dartboard deal where, well, hell, whoever shows up, I guess that's who's going to buy them. And that's true, but don't think that a competent auction guy hasn't done his homework. And if he's not, you probably ought to look somewhere else. If you have numbers of any sufficient amount whatsoever. We've got cattle every week, and we have, my gosh, 80 years worth of list of buyers that have participated here and do so on a weekly basis, and some come and some go, but we have to be on track of who's buying what, and then make sure that we have an offering that that they'll be able to come to the sale and fill whatever orders they need. I think quality sellers, they or quality buyers really want the cattle that are right for them, and they trust the auction guy to put two and two together that way. You know, I mean, we get a lot of information from buyers. John, here's what I've got. I've got a guy that is going to wheat. He wants to buy some little lightweight calves and start some little 3 weights and da 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 da. And Lauren, I may say, man, he's going to have a tough time getting a load out of here this week. But in 2 weeks, I've got those Moylan calves coming, and boy, they'll fit him perfect, and they're this and they're this and they're this. So there's always a communication going on that way with the buyer, but also with the seller. I'd stay away from this week. We got a holiday, Labor Day coming up. Let's wait a week. I can surround you with more like cattle, like what you have got, and buyers will be able to make loads out of them. So it's a constant communication between buyer and seller, and an auction operator is kind of the intermediary that's putting the two mindsets together. And as you have more experience, not only with the buyer, but also with the seller, that trust grows and grows and grows. And we'll have a lot of sales. And I already tell you who's going to buy them, because we've
Yeah.
identified that individual or two or three or four of them, and it'll be one of these three guys that end up with them, because we've tracked that guy down and said, hey, I know what you want, and we got him. So, like I said, it's more in depth, I think, than people realize.
Yeah. As someone who's kind of like the intermediary person, you work with sellers, you work with buyers, you work with everyone else in between across the spectrum. Is there anything that you talk to buyers all the time and they're like, I wish more sellers understood this aspect, or I wish more people just understood this aspect of kind of like what happens to their cattle after the market, or just what are your thoughts there? Is there anything that just kind of gets lost in the weeds that either side needs to understand a little bit more of?
I guess the first thing that comes to mind would be what's involved, health aspect wise, numbers wise. I think the seller really, and it's hard because they're not wearing that hat, but put the buyer's hat on and think about what questions he's got to answer to his people that he's buying from. He may be convinced that they're the greatest thing in the world, better than sliced bread. It's just perfect. Yeah. But today, for what I've got, I can use them or I can't use them. They don't fit my specific order that I got today. Tomorrow, yeah, maybe. Next week, maybe you'll have it. And I think a lot of times buyers don't, or sellers maybe don't appreciate that, how important the freshness, how important the health is, because we've got a whole nother scenario that's taken place after the cattle leave the ring. And some are just going to go and get turned out. Some are going to get shut up. They're going to be fed in a bunk, new surroundings that they've never seen before. And the buyer is dealing with a lot of variables too. It isn't just a one size fits all when the buyer comes. We have differences in conformation, differences in color, differences in condition, depending on who's actually buying the cattle. Do I have a guy that just wants commodity cattle? Three colored that's okay to put together and da 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 da. I have a price for that. I have a home for those. Or do I have just the toughest guy in the world to buy for, and everything has just got to be perfect for him to participate? He'll participate at crazy high levels if everything is done just right. And again, that's where your auction operator comes back in. He ought to be able to classify those cattle according to where the demand is based on your specific consignment. We'll color a lot of cattle here. If it looks like the black deal's a runaway, or the reds, or red Angus females. If that's the case, well, you don't want to stick a black in there when you're getting $500 a head or $100 a head more for a straight set of high influence red Angus cattle. You're better to help the seller to cut the black off. And it may work in the opposite. And it depends on how many cattle you have. If you only have 5, you're kind of defeating the purpose to color them 3 ways and then size them and sell them one at a time. You're better off to bunch them up at the end of the day. So again, that goes back to the guy you've got representing you, not only as being a buyer, but Mr. Seller, the same guy's representing you, and kind of put it in his hands and know what questions to ask, but how's the best way to merchandise what I've got to sell?
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. As we round out the podcast, is there any other closing comments, anything else that you want to leave with our audience today, John?
I think we're great. I appreciate it, and I hope everybody is maybe not getting an education, but getting a different viewpoint on maybe some questions that we all have, and different philosophies that are out there, and just a little bit of the why the results ended the way they did when I had a great experience at the auction. Maybe what took place behind the scenes that way that created the environment that I was able to sell into. And sometimes that can be bad. And if it is, why, those are questions you need to ask as well.
Yes, 100%. Well, John, as always, thank you so much for your time and all of the knowledge and thoughts and candidness that you share with us and our audience. We appreciate it as always. To all of our listeners out there, we hope you have a great rest of your week. Like, subscribe, rate, review, do all of the things. If you enjoyed John's podcast today, make sure you let us know, leave us a comment, leave us all the things. We appreciate it here at the team, and we will see you all tomorrow on another episode. Have a great week, y'all.